Ice doesn't just cover the ground. It seals things away. It locks moments in time and holds onto them long after the rest of the world has moved on. A leaf that fell 1,000 years ago, a creature that took its last breath during the last ice age, even a soldier who never made it home from a war fought over a century ago. Ice can preserve all of it with a precision that no laboratory could ever match. There's no oxygen breaking things down, no bacteria feasting on soft tissue, no sunlight bleaching away detail. Just cold, silence, and time standing still. And as our planet warms and glaciers retreat, that frozen vault is slowly cracking open, one melting season at a time. Scientists, hikers, and sometimes just ordinary people out for a walk have stumbled onto discoveries that rewrote history books, unsettled entire fields of science, and occasionally left researchers with more questions than they started with. Some of these finds are ancient, tracing back thousands, or even tens of thousands of years. Others are more recent, tragedies frozen mid-moment, and only now being returned to the people who never stopped waiting for answers. And a few are so strange that scientists still aren't entirely sure what to make of them. Today we're counting down some of the most astonishing things ever pulled from the ice, and trust me, a few of these are going to surprise you. Let's get into it. Skiing feels like a modern sport, something you picture on a resort slope with lift tickets and hot cocoa waiting at the lodge. But humans have been strapping wood to their feet and gliding across snow for far longer than most people realize. In the mountains of Norway, in a shrinking patch of ice known for spitting out ancient artifacts as it melts, researchers found a ski that had been resting there for roughly 13 centuries. What made this find remarkable wasn't just its age. Plenty of old skis have surfaced over the years. It was the condition. The wood was intact, the binding was still attached, and every detail that usually rots away within decades had somehow survived over 1,000 years. Even more remarkable, this wasn't the first ski found at that particular ice patch. Years earlier, researchers had found its mate, but this second ski completed what is now considered the best-preserved pair of ancient skis on Earth. Somewhere in Norway, more than 1,000 years ago, a person walked away from these skis and never came back for them. Ice did the rest. In the early 1950s, a massive American military transport plane went down in the mountains of Alaska. Every single person aboard was lost, and the wreckage settled into terrain so hostile that recovery teams simply couldn't reach it. For decades, the crash site sat untouched, buried under snow and ice, effectively frozen out of history. It wasn't until the surrounding glacier began retreating that fragments of the aircraft started reappearing. Seat cushions, personal items, pieces of the fuselage, all remarkably intact considering how much time had passed. The terrain around the crash remains brutally difficult to access, which meant recovery crews had to work in narrow windows when conditions allowed. When they finally managed to retrieve what remained, they were able to identify the individuals aboard using flight records, giving families a resolution they had waited generations for. It's a sobering reminder that ice doesn't just preserve curiosities. Sometimes it preserves tragedy, and sometimes melting it away is what finally allows people to grieve properly. Not everything on this list has been buried for centuries. Some of these moments are happening right now, and they're just as strange to witness. Military submarines occasionally need to demonstrate a maneuver called vertical ice surfacing, essentially forcing their way up through a solid sheet of Arctic ice using nothing but buoyancy and brute mechanical force. Footage of this happening looks almost unbelievable, a massive steel hull erupting upward through what looks like solid ground, sending ice and snow flying in every direction. The maneuver exists as a safety measure. If a submarine finds itself trapped beneath ice during an emergency, being able to break through from below could be the difference between survival and disaster. It's not an easy skill to develop, and it's still relatively rare among submarine crews, but as Arctic operations become more common, it's likely we'll see this maneuver practiced far more often in the years ahead. Woolly mammoths tend to exist in the public imagination as cartoon characters or museum skeletons, but every so often, the permafrost hands scientists something that makes the animal feel unnervingly real. In the early 2000s, researchers in a remote stretch of Siberia uncovered the frozen remains of an adult male mammoth so well preserved that much of its skin, soft tissue, and even sections of its digestive tract remained intact. Its head had been sealed in permafrost for so long that skin still covered the skull, something almost never seen in specimens this old. Scientists were able to examine tusks, limbs, and internal tissue in a level of detail usually reserved for animals that died within the last few years, not thousands of years ago. Discoveries like this have done more to advance our understanding of mammoth biology than almost any fossil ever could, simply because ice doesn't fossilize an animal, it preserves it. Researchers were able to study muscle fibers, examine stomach contents to figure out exactly what the animal had been eating in its final days, and compare its anatomy directly to modern elephants in ways that bone fragments alone would never allow. It's the difference between reading a description of an animal and actually standing in a room with it. Deep in the same frozen region of Siberia, researchers uncovered the remains of a woolly rhinoceros unlike anything previously documented. The animal was young, likely only a few years old at the time of its death, and everything from its fur to its internal organs remained in place after tens of thousands of years frozen in the ground. What stirred the most debate is that its features don't perfectly match what scientists expected woolly rhinos to look like based on prior fossil evidence. That mismatch has left researchers with two possibilities. Either this individual represents a variation scientists hadn't accounted for, or the specimen is forcing a reconsideration of what we thought we knew about the species as a whole. Either way, it's a rare case where a single frozen body might end up reshaping decades of established science. High in the mountains of northern Italy, a war was fought that most people have never heard of. During the First World War, Austro-Hungarian and Italian soldiers clashed in brutal alpine conditions, in a conflict historians now refer to as the White War, a name that captures both the setting and the sheer number of soldiers who died not from combat, but from the mountain itself. One barracks, carved into the ice near a peak known for its harsh winters, was abandoned by its occupants and then sealed shut by the very cold that had made it so miserable to live in. It stayed that way for roughly a century. When the ice finally receded enough for researchers to enter, they found the barracks essentially frozen in the exact moment it had been left. Tools, letters, weapons, and personal belongings scattered exactly where they'd been dropped. It offered historians a window into daily life on one of the war's most forgotten fronts, preserved with a clarity that traditional archaeological digs almost never achieve. Most people assume that anywhere buried under Antarctic ice must be frozen solid all the way through. That assumption breaks down the moment you learn about subglacial lakes, bodies of liquid water trapped beneath massive ice sheets, insulated and pressurized just enough to stay unfrozen. The largest of these, located deep beneath the Antarctic ice near the pole of extreme cold, sits roughly 2 miles below the surface. Despite being buried under one of the most hostile environments on the planet, it still ranks among the largest lakes in the world by volume. It has been cut off from sunlight, from the atmosphere, and from the rest of the planet's ecosystem for what scientists estimate to be millions of years. Drilling into a lake like that isn't simple. Contamination risks are enormous, and researchers have to be extraordinarily careful not to introduce modern microbes into an environment that has been sealed for so long. What might be living down there, evolving in total isolation for that length of time, remains one of the more tantalizing mysteries in modern science. In the early 1990s, hikers in the Alps stumbled onto something that looked, at first glance, like a modern accident victim. It turned out to be the mummified remains of a man who had died more than 5,000 years earlier, preserved almost perfectly by the ice and snow that buried him shortly after his death. Investigators later determined that he hadn't simply frozen to death. An arrowhead was found lodged in his shoulder, along with other wounds suggesting he'd been involved in a violent confrontation shortly before he died. His remains, along with his clothing, tools, and equipment, gave archaeologists an unprecedented look at how people actually lived during the Copper Age, filling in details that written records could never have provided since writing hadn't even been invented yet in that part of the world. Decades later, his body is still being studied, and new details about his life, his health, and even his final movements continue to emerge. Researchers have examined his stomach contents to reconstruct his last meal, studied his tattoos to understand early medicinal practices, and even sequenced his DNA to trace his genetic ancestry back to populations living in Europe thousands of years before recorded history began. Few discoveries have ever given historians this much direct, physical evidence about a single individual from so far back in human history, and his remains continue to be preserved and displayed so that researchers can keep learning from him decades after he was first found. Perhaps the most unsettling entry on this list doesn't involve something visibly frozen at all. It involves something microscopic. In the early 2020s, researchers drilling into ice on the Tibetan Plateau discovered dozens of viruses, some estimated to be around 15,000 years old, still intact within the ice itself. The deeper the ice core went, the older the trapped material became, essentially creating a timeline of atmospheric history stretching back thousands of years. Most of the viruses identified had never been cataloged before, meaning scientists were looking at genetic material with no modern equivalent. To study the ice without contaminating it, researchers had to develop entirely new extraction methods, ensuring that whatever they found had actually been present in the ice and hadn't been introduced during collection. As glaciers around the world continue shrinking at record speed, more of this ancient biological material is expected to be released, some of it harmless, and some of it entirely unknown to modern science. Antarctica is already one of the most inhospitable places on the planet, yet life has found a way to cling to nearly every corner of it. Hardy microbes, resilient bacteria, organisms built to survive conditions that would kill almost anything else. That's what made one particular discovery so strange. A team of researchers exploring a remote stretch of the continent came across a perfectly circular patch of ground where nothing appeared to have ever lived. No microbes, no bacteria, no trace of biological activity of any kind in any of the samples collected. Even the snow coverage in the area was thinner than expected, as if the region had been avoided by every natural process that normally leaves some kind of biological footprint. Scientists are still trying to understand what makes this specific patch of ground so different from everywhere else on the continent. But the implications reach far beyond Antarctica. If a completely barren, lifeless zone can exist naturally on Earth, it strengthens the case that entire alien worlds could be barren in the same way, with none of the biological markers we typically search for when hunting for life elsewhere in the universe. From a single ski buried for over 1,000 years to a patch of ground where life itself seems to refuse to exist, ice has quietly been holding onto some of the strangest secrets our planet has to offer. And as glaciers and permafrost continue to retreat around the world, more of these discoveries are almost certainly waiting to surface. Researchers who specialize in this kind of work often describe a race against time. Every warm summer means more artifacts, more remains, and more biological material get exposed to open air, where decay finally has a chance to catch up on centuries, or even millennia, of lost time. Once something melts out of the ice, there's often no putting it back. Some of these discoveries will fascinate us. Some of them, like those ancient viruses waking up after 15,000 years, might make us a little uneasy about what else could be waiting beneath the surface. Either way, it's a powerful reminder that the past isn't always gone. Sometimes it's just frozen, waiting for the right moment to resurface and remind us how much history and how much mystery the ice has been holding onto the entire time. Which one of these discoveries surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this journey through the ice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that prove truth is often stranger than fiction.